Hello, future me and maybe other viewers. I think is the fourth official episode of this project. And this time we are looking at Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. First of all, this might have the most beautiful cover work of anything. That is just the most beautiful. I want to say it's taken from a newspaper from the 1600s. I want to say that's the case. But anyways, that beauty does not necessarily extend to the rest of the book. This book I read as part of a health and literature course that I'm taking currently. We were required to only read about the first 100 pages. I finished the rest of it. It took me about 2 weeks to finish in about 3 sittings. Yeah. The hard part about this book, there are 2 really big hard parts. Really, really big reasons why this book is difficult to read. Number 1, it is written in 17th century English prose. It is just time-consuming to read because it's not what we would consider standard or contemporary English. I don't remember the exact year that this was published, but I know Daniel Defoe was born in 1616, so I want to say that this was probably published in the 1680s to 90s, maybe. But that's the case, right? Late 17th century, early 18th century English prose, which makes this very difficult to read. The second thing that makes this very difficult to read is it is 200 pages of unbroken text. What I mean by that is there is the introduction, which was put in about 1730, I believe. There's an introduction by a different author. Then the story of A Journal of the Plague Year. Then about 4 appendixes of extra things. There is about 230 pages of just unbroken text, which is sometimes, you can get away with it, right? But there's no real good stopping point. Generally, I stopped at charts that are put into here and things like that. That's generally just where I stop because I could at least go like, oh, I read up to the chart. But that unbroken 230 pages combined with its prose and the words that it's using, along with the fact that this is not a book that takes place over a day. It takes place over a year. So it's 230 pages, but you're going through the entire year. There's no stop or start point for each day. It just kind of goes in the next one, and it just makes it very, very hard to read. However, the content of this book, if you can get past that, is really, really great. It has less of an impact now simply because we have lived through this book. That was the initial point of reading this book for the class that I'm reading it as a part of, is to show to show the similarity between the health and life of the plague in London and the one that we experienced through COVID. And it is great. However, this is going to go off a tangent about not the book. This book goes beat for beat what the United States response to the COVID pandemic was. I mean, beat for beat. And it's just wild. It is so wild to think that 400 years later, 4 centuries later, this country has not progressed at all beyond what the initial response of the plague was. It is just astounding. Just astounding and heartbreaking. But you know, that's all kind of beside the point of my own frustrations of all of this. But that's okay. The book itself. It's fun. I shouldn't say it's fun. It's not. It's an enjoyable read, but you just have to get past the things that make it difficult. And at times it's just kind of mind-numbing. It's kind of along the same way as Walden was with Henry David Thoreau, in which sometimes it just goes off on something and you're just read through pages and pages of something that doesn't matter, which is also makes this kind of difficult to read. This book is heralded as kind of like one of the truest recollections of the plague, which is weird because it's actually a fiction narrative. The story goes, or supposedly the way this book was written, was that Daniel Defoe had an uncle who's is like Harry Few or something. I don't remember his actual name. And this is kind of like Daniel Defoe's uncle's story. And then Daniel Defoe did some other research that kind of put into this, which is where I think we get a lot of the charts from. But it's a fiction story. It is a fictional retelling of the plague, yet it is heralded as one of the greatest plague stories and collections of what the plague was like, which is weird. It's an odd thing. Daniel Defoe does a really interesting thing throughout all of this, in which he recognizes and admits that the plague and pandemics in general are poor person diseases. And what I mean by that is they are a disease that only affects people that cannot up and move away from where the infection is. We see through like the narrative and the story of there is the rich and the well-to-do of London are able to pick up and move into the surrounding areas of London and the surrounding smaller towns and the country houses and all of this, while the poor are forced to be stuck in London. Now, London at this time is very, very compact, even more so than it is now. So it was just domino after domino after domino of infection, because there was nowhere else for these people to go. And that's and it's related to how COVID ended up working in the United States, was that your really densely populated areas had super heavy infections, but part of it was that there was nothing else that they could do because they don't have the money to up and move, but they also don't have the money to just kind of sit back in their house and do nothing the entire time. They are forced to go out and work, even if it risks their health. They were forced to go out and get food, even if it risks their health. They cannot stockpile food as many people of wealth could. Okay, that was that. I'll go back to the other thing about the Russia thing. So the way this book kind of ends up laying out is, I think, oddly, the most important part happens towards the end, but isn't the end. It's very, very briefly mentioned. But as Defoe writes, part of this is when you had everyone die, and then people come back. The rich people kind of start coming back, even though they probably shouldn't, but they come back. And they find that there's really no work because there's no more market. And then everyone just kind of exists in this kind of limbo state where nothing's really getting done. There's no work really happening. There's no money to be made anywhere. And then the Great London Fire happens. That happens like 2 years after the plague swept through London. Burned a whole bunch of stuff down. Burned a whole bunch of material goods. So guess who's back in business? Everyone else. Every single person that labors and that manufactures and then sells goods, they're all back in business. Now, this is also eerily similar to the United States predicament right now. Date I'm recording this is February 11th, 2022. It is the date that the United States has officially said all Americans in the Ukraine, you leave immediately. I believe there's supposed to be a meeting tomorrow between Biden and Putin of what Putin's plans are. But with that being said, we're kind of in that limbo state, right? Where for the past year or so, throughout pretty much a lot of 2021, there is the labor and the manufacturing jobs, they're just kind of gone. They're not doing anything right now. A lot of that is because there's no demand for them like there was before. There's no longer this really big demand for a whole bunch of products because no one has money. However, if the Russia thing and the Ukraine thing escalates and eventually devolves into a much bigger issue involving the world, that would probably serve as the same catalyst as the Great London Fire. As unfortunate as it's to say, that would be, much like in most American history, a war would be an economic boom, and I hate that. I hate that wars are economic booms for us and that we are a war-based economy. But you know, anyways, that's all of my thoughts on Daniel Defoe's A Journal of a Plague Year. It's like a 4.5 out of 10. I don't know, 4.5 maybe. I don't think it's a 5. I don't think anyone would ever read this for fun, for their own pleasure. But it's still a good read. I just don't think anyone would read it for pleasure. And that's that.